everything should work. So today we're going to cover mostly conformity processes, and then we'll cover a little bit of obedience. What does it mean to conform your behavior?
Do what is socially acceptable.
Good.
Maybe against your own inclination.
And so, with whom do you conform? You conform with your peers, people you want to be with. Who else? What's that? Authority figures, family members.
People who are around you.
People who are around you. Your, what we call your social environment. These are all part of your, these people are all part of your social environment. And so we have these kind of drives. I'll say they're very much motivations. Remember when we talked about motivation, one of the motivations that has to do with wanting to be around people is the what?
Need for affiliation.
The need for affiliation, or the affiliation motive, yeah. And so these are very basic needs that we have to be around people in our social environment. Now, what happens when someone...
2 weeks in a row.
Another drug deal, okay. Glad you're getting rich. You start sharing that money with us, though. So we have this need to want to be around other people. Now, what happens if we are around other people and we behave behave in ways that are very undesirable or unlikable? They don't want to be around you, and so they shun you, right? They ostracize you. Ostracization is one of the most powerful tools for bringing people's behavior back into the line, right? If, you don't dress like us, you can't be in our group, right? High school, right? What's this movie? I love this movie. It's it redoes Emma with Alicia Silverstone. Clueless, right? Yeah. So these are very powerful influences that really drive our behavior to conform to other people. And so one of the ways that we know how to behave in a conforming manner so that we don't get ostracized is that we have roles in society that we fill, and there are norms associated with those roles. So what do I mean by a social norm? Good. So what's normal, right? So it is really a set of rules that kind of tell us, usually an unwritten set of rules, that tell us what is acceptable behavior in this social situation. So we get information about that from a number of different places. We get it from other people, right? If we start acting funny, they kind of look at us, or maybe they call the police, right, to have us taken away, right? Or the men in the white jackets, right? White coats. And, but also the environment, right? You come into a classroom, the first day of class, you came into this classroom, you didn't know any of these people. But the room itself, it communicates to you that there are going to be certain norms here, depending on your role. Your role as a student is to sit down and learn from me as I pontificate all of the complexities of human behavior to you. And my role as an instructor is to try to pontificate to you in a meaningful, hopefully, way that about behavior and these rules. So this room kind of communicates some of that. When you go into a club, a dance club, that's an environment where the norms are entirely different than they are here, right? So these norms are communicated somewhat by the physical environment, definitely by the people. You come in here the first day of class, a bunch of other people are sitting here quietly. You come in and start spouting off about how great the Indians are at baseball and how you can't wait till they beat the Red Sox. And, you do this long enough, people are going to start like, what's up? What's up with that? Yeah. Now, if you sat down and started talking about how the Red Sox were great and they were going to beat the Indians, everybody would go, oh, yeah. No. So you come in here and you sit down quietly, you wait for the instructor. That's normed behavior. You're in your social role and you're behaving in normal ways. And so these roles are really these sets of expected behaviors that we have based on what our role is. So you might be, for example, a mother. And being a mother has a social role. If you do not fulfill your social role, people will start telling you about it, right? Those of you who are parents. Maybe it's your mother-in-law, right? Or maybe it's your neighbor, or maybe it's the police, right? What do you mean you left your kid at the park overnight, right? They're going to take you away, right? And then that's like criminal, right?
The lady who left her child out in the buggy outside of the restaurant that was from Switzerland or whatever. And he was like, oh my goodness, she left her baby out there. It's like, go back to Switzerland or wherever it was. That's what they do because the air is good for the child. It's a safer environment. But here,
Yeah.
it's not okay.
So social roles are communicated and enforced by culture and society, right? Yeah. And the alternative would be if you, instead of leaving your child in the buggy, is that what you said? Is that like a cat buggy? I take my cat around in the cat buggy. You leave your child in the buggy outside the restaurant. That's normal in Switzerland. But if you were in Switzerland and you brought your child inside, they would go, well, you're such a bad parent, right? So these roles we have, and we fill these roles, and we're happy to fill them. We feel oftentimes really good when we perform our role appropriately. Even though that may not really be what we want to do, but because we've taken on that role voluntarily or sometimes involuntarily, and we get this positive reinforcement from people when we do behave in that role, we feel good about it. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes we feel constrained. Big boys don't cry, right? And so these roles and norms have both beneficial and deleterious consequences, unpleasant consequences. So, but it's important to know that our attitudes toward ourselves can oftentimes be affected strongly by these roles and whether we do or don't fill them properly. And then, of course, we look at other people in very, we expect them to fill their roles, and if they don't, we tell them. Sometimes very blatantly, sometimes very subtly. Usually very subtly. We'll give a weird look at somebody, right? We don't just snap their head off immediately. But if they persist, we'll increase the pressure to try to bring their behavior back into line. So really, these roles, they're established by culture and society. We take them on either voluntarily or involuntarily, and then ultimately they are conditioned. We're operantly conditioned to stay in that role, assuming other people want us to. Now this becomes a bit of a problem when we think about, for example, family systems. And when we talk about psychological disorders, we'll talk about family systems theory. Family systems theory says that families have these roles that we fulfill for each other. And one of those roles can sometimes be like the screw-up, the kid who never does anything right. And then when the kid who never does anything right finally gets their act together, guess what? Everybody else says, you know, subtly or not so subtly, tries to get that kid to screw up again, right? So, so this kind of family dynamics can sometimes force us to behave in ways that are maybe not so adaptive and sometimes maladaptive. Right? Questions, comments on social roles and norms? I want to show you a little video clip, but I have to pause the podcast for a second because it contains some profanity.
Sit down with you, goof off.
Put a condom on his head.
Silly stuff.
So what, based on you know, what we've talked about in terms of social roles and social norms, what's your take on that whole clip? I mean, I've been thinking, I only saw it first about 2 hours ago, so I haven't had time to really think through it a whole lot. But what's your take on that stuff? What's going on there?
I really liked the question that was asked, and why people want to subject themselves to that.
Okay, so first, why do the customers want to step outside their normal social role as customers and welcome the abuse? Because it's not our normal role as customers to be abused by shop merchants, right?
Well, it's, you know, amongst friends, it's, you know, it's their comfort level and the safety thing. If you don't know someone and they insult you, they're not usually joking with you because they don't know you.
Okay, so so among friends, being, you know, joking around, being insulting, can be acceptable. So it may be one way for them to really, you know, feel like they're in this friendly community, right? Which, you know, it looks like at the beginning of the night at least, right? So it may be, you know, this guy has this whole Freudian thing of, you know, they drink and they have guilt, so they want to be punished, and it's like, no, forget about it. So what else? What else do you take out of that? Yeah.
It's you can step outside your cultural role and, you know, control in a way earlier on. You can kind of have control over what happens when you did step outside of your social role. You can kind of, there's a certain level of control, which, I mean, usually you don't step outside because you have no control over what happens after that. So it gives that sort of comfort level, if you're able to control somewhat, which maybe you don't really have to worry about things coming out and being bad at you.
Okay, so we have these social roles, and we feel somewhat constrained by our social roles. And so it kind of feels good to step outside the role, knowing that the consequences won't be too bad. You know, I mean, I have a social role, which is, you know, not to go down into the hood and start insulting, you know, people that are Mexican or black or whatever, right? I'm a white boy, I'm gonna go down there, I'm gonna keep my mouth shut. And so, yeah, so it kind of gives these people the opportunity to kind of step out of that role for a bit, kind of play with the dynamics if the social roles weren't enforced. What else? Yeah.
Well, it seems like those who took it too far have just been, you know, really, really wanting to insult somebody, and they just didn't have any idea of the fun of it. They just, you know,
Yeah. So we'll
wanted
talk.
to insult somebody.
We
I
will.
didn't get really any actual enjoyment out of it.
Yeah. We will talk about a little bit later. We'll talk about the Catharsis Hypothesis, and the Catharsis Hypothesis suggests that, you know, if you're into Freud, we have all these unacceptable feelings in the id, and they kind of get stuffed down there, and the superego keeps them at bay, and if we let them bubble out, that they will somehow you know, help us feel better, and we won't be as aggressive in the future, which turns out it's Catharsis Hypothesis full of crap. But what else you take out of that?
I think the biggest
Okay.
That's my take on just about, that's probably one of the more universal things from at least East Coast to West Coast when a lot of things are not.
Okay.
And so when you go to some place when they're razzing you know, lightly, then you're like, oh, that must be a friend.
I'm feeling like
and then you get to break down the hi, you know, you're just like, oh, there's a little more of a trust is extended.
Okay. Okay.
You know, you're like, hey, I'm human, you're human, who cares?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, to some extent, some people probably really do carry those ideas, like that bigoted mindset. You know, think of where they said it's located in a rich white neighborhood. You know,
Yeah.
their inhibitions are completely other.
Okay.
So I think some people really do think. I mean, people do think that way.
Okay. So you brought up the idea of inhibitions, right? Inhibitions. What is it that inhibits their behavior normally? Well, yeah, the operant conditioning, but we can say broadly this stuff, right? That helps inhibit, it helps keep their behavior in certain boundaries, right? Now, here's a funny thing. What happens when the people are drunk in this clip?
Inhibitions are gone.
So the inhibitions drop way down. So they start sort of getting a little, you know, they start pushing the boundary of the norms and roles, right? And why do they keep going though? Because everybody around them supports it. In not, you know, even if they're not directly participating, just their presence creates conformity, right? And all of a sudden, the conformity pressures start to take hold where the normal behavior is to engage in these behaviors like this. Now, here's an interesting thing about alcohol and inhibition. The alcohol has something called a disinhibition effect. But the interesting thing is that for a reasonably large number of people, the disinhibition effect will kick in if they're in a party environment, even if they haven't had any alcohol. So if we give them a placebo alcohol, which we can make, looks like vodka, tastes like vodka, smells like vodka, and we get them to think they've been drinking, we get the behaviors. So it's not actually the alcohol that's allowing them to become disinhibited. It's their own beliefs that allow them to drop their inhibitions, right? And the beliefs that this is normal behavior in this environment, right? So our social environment exerts an extraordinary amount of pressure on our behaviors. Anything else you want to bring up here? Yeah.
Well, it sounds like they're also coming out of environments where those inhibitions are already lowered because if they're coming out of bars, they've been in an environment
Sure.
for a long time. So a bunch of people who already have those lowered inhibitions and just getting together, going on for hours more, you know?
Yep, that's true. Now, I will say that I'm not ignoring the weird dynamics of this restaurant with all white customers and all black people behind the counter, right? That's setting up this, that starts to set up this weird dynamic anyway in itself, right?
It would be the same if it were black customers, black servers, or white.
I would expect so, if they could norm that behavior.
I would say that type of razzing goes along no matter what culture I've ever, no matter what, that's like
You know.
really the one constant thing that happens. Your friends razz you and you build trust from that. And
Ult-
I've seen that in every culture that I've lived in this way.
Ultimately, you know, the people behind the counter really do have the control. You know, if it goes too far, you know, they can shut the place down and call the cops, right? So there is a certain amount of complicity going on between the people in the behind the counter and the people in front. But be that as it may. All right, so the other thing that we think about in social psychology is not just that stuff out there, but the stuff inside here too. So the attitudes that we have and the behaviors that may be associated with those attitudes. So when we think about attitudes, we generally tend to think of attitudes as having three different components. One component of attitudes is stuff we think, right? It's cognitions we have about other people, about ourselves, about the situation. And these are generally rational beliefs that we have. If they're irrational beliefs, then we're into abnormal psychology, and that's not the topic of this class. So, feelings, basically emotions, affect, and then actions. So, if attitudes sort of have all of this stuff, do behaviors result from attitudes, or do attitudes result from our behaviors? Which way does it go? Yeah, give me an example of it going back and forth.
I don't know the specifics, but if you believe something but you don't act on it, then you don't believe it very strongly. But once you act on it, you're like saying to the world, this is what I believe, and you can't really go back on that, and so that belief is strengthened all the more.
Good. So our actions, our behaviors can serve to strengthen our attitudes or our beliefs. And we do respond to things in our environment. We act out in behaviors as a product of our attitudes. So it really does go both ways. And in fact, sometimes when there's some inconsistency between our attitudes and our behaviors, we will change one or the other so that we bring it back into consistency. We like to have consistency in our attitudes. We like to have consistency between our attitudes and our behaviors. And we'll play all kinds of funny mind games to try to convince ourselves that there is consistency when there really isn't. But that's we'll talk about that later. So, classic example of this connection. That's where I lost my chapstick. I'm going to throw it away. Classic, I don't know where it's been. Classic example of this connection is what happens when you go to the used car salesman and you're not really planning on buying a car, but somehow you wind up leaving the place with a car and you really don't know how you got there, right? It's kind of like, well, I really wasn't going to buy a car when I got here, but now I got a car. How'd that happen? And that's what's broadly kind of referred to as the foot in the door phenomenon. Because if I were to come here, for example, if I were going to sell you some encyclopedias and I knocked on the door and you opened the door and I said, can I talk to you about my encyclopedias? And you say, no, go away. By the time you close the door, I got my foot in here. So I can't close the door. So now that one little concession, I'm shaking the room, that one little concession allows the beginning of asking for a little bit more concession. So once you come into my place and I give you if you're at my used car store and I give you a soda, what's that?
Classic example. You give a mouse a cookie.
Give them.
You want a glass of milk for it.
Yeah, there you go. That's what happens. Reciprocity. No, if the mouse gives you a cookie, then you want to give him a glass of milk. So no, so you go into the store, and the salesman says, I know you don't want to buy a car today, but tell you what, just let me show you this brand, this shiny blue car I got out here. I think you'll really like it, and next time you come in, you'll like to see it. And you go, well, I really don't have time to do that today. Well, just take a look at it, sit in it, see what you think. You go out there, you sit in it, and the salesman says, well, we're having this great promotion this week, and I could really put you in this car for a lot less money if you just come in the office and we'll work something out. You say, well, I really don't want to buy a car. Well, just come on in the office, right? And so it's this idea of kind of getting you to get used to the idea of going along. And now you're sitting in the office and you got the paperwork in front of you and you're thinking, I didn't really come here to buy a car, but I am sitting in the office. Either I'm a sucker and stupid, or I really do want to buy a car. So I'll say, well, maybe I can really do want to buy a car and not want to be a sucker and stupid. And so next thing you know, you're walking out of there with a used car and you hadn't really intended to. That doesn't mean that you don't need a car. Doesn't mean that a car wasn't a good deal. But these are ways of sort of getting you to change your attitude a little bit. And another great example of this is what happens when we get people to do things that they really don't believe are the right things to do. And how can we do that? And really, it relies on these same kinds of principles. Basically, get someone to give some little concession, then ask them for a little bit bigger concession, and then ask them for a much bigger concession. And if you ease them into it and you start changing their behavior, their attitude will follow, because they don't want their attitude to be inconsistent with the behavior. And it's easier to change attitudes than behaviors in a lot of cases. Okay, and this is known as cognitive dissonance theory, which we'll talk about later, I think. This example with the guard and the soldier and we've got all kinds of other factors working here. For one thing, hierarchy, right? In militaries, there are hierarchies, and if your superior tells you to do something, you do it, damn it. And that's called obedience, right? And obedience is a good thing on the battlefield, because you don't want someone to equivocate when you tell them to do something, right? Because you need to have them at the right place at the right time, or else everything falls apart. But in these kinds of situations, it can set up the opportunity for really awful things to start happening too.
Group think.
I'm not going to call that situation groupthink. But groupthink does have a lot of these same kinds of conformity pressures. It doesn't have so much of the obedience kind of pressures that
But I just
in
think what's going on
here.
around you by the other soldiers and stuff, the way they're doing kind of making it seem like, not such a bad thing, even though it's something you never do
Right.
in America or something, all these situations.
Right. So what will happen is if we're in a group of people and they start doing something that we think isn't the right thing to do, if they're unanimous, a lot of times we'll just go along with them because we like to get along with people. And it's easier to go along with them than to stand up and be the weirdo that says, hey, stop, we're not doing that. And then they start ridiculing you, right? And then you're like, all right. So incredibly strong pressures for conformity. So as I said, if our attitudes are inconsistent, then something called cognitive dissonance occurs. And Leon Festinger proposed a theory to explain why, how we deal with those kinds of inconsistencies in our beliefs. And he started this research. One of his first experiments was to go into one of these, I think they're called Millenarian Cults. Anybody in religion here? Study religion? These are groups that believe the world is ending. Is that right? Apocalyptic kind of cults. And so there was this group, I think they were in Colorado, and he and his research assistant basically joined the group to find out how they worked and what happened when they predicted the world would end on February 15th and February 16th came along. How did they reconcile that inconsistency, right? And what he found was that basically when their attitudes became inconsistent, they started doing all kinds of things to try to explain it away and to try to bring their attitudes back into consistency. And People who smoke go through this all the time. You know, the classic example is smoking. If I smoke cigarettes and I think that I'm the kind of person that doesn't really take unnecessary risks, right? I'm a just average Joe. You know, I don't drive at 90 miles an hour and jump off cliffs with parachutes and stuff, right? I'm just, you know, just going through life doing my thing. But I also know from my learning that smoking causes cancer. So do you see the inconsistency there? So my behavior and my attitudes are inconsistent. So I'm going to have to do one of two things. I'm either going to have to change my behavior or my attitudes. And I need to do that because, according to Festinger, what happens is we get this uncomfortable kind of feeling when we become uncomfortably aroused when we have these inconsistent attitudes. And we have to resolve that discomfort in some way. And to resolve that, as I said, we're going to have to change behavior or we're going to have to change our attitudes. Well, the problem is that changing this behavior is difficult and some would say impossible because of the intensely addictive nature of nicotine, right? It's an extraordinarily addictive drug. Nicotine, the crack form of cocaine, and heroin are probably the three most addictive drugs that we have right now. And so if I can't change that, I'm going to have to change one of these, right? So either I'm going to have to start accepting that I am the kind of person who takes unreasonable risks, and if I think people who take unreasonable risks are not nice people, that's going to create a problem. So maybe I'll change this thought that smoking causes cancer. And I might say, well, you know, yeah, those doctors published all those studies, you know, those thousands of studies, but I won't say thousand. Those doctors published a few studies a long time ago that said smoking caused cancer. But you know what? I read an article just last week that said that apple pie causes problems in digestion. And then another study a week later that said apple pie is fine for you. So those doctors really don't know what they're talking about. They're always publishing contradictory studies, right? So I can smoke. So you change this and you say, well, yeah, not really, right? Or you maybe just ignore it. Maybe think it's going to go away. Go into denial, repression, right? If you want to be a Freudian about it, yeah. What's that? So if I think that if I have this belief that how would the cognitions become inconsistent though? In the global warming example. Okay, so I believe that global warming is a threat to humanity. Okay, what's the other cognition that's inconsistent with that? No. What's that? So I drive a Hummer. Okay, start with the behavior. I drive a Hummer and I care about the environment. I'm a good citizen. I care about the environment. You know, I'd give money to the Sierra Club. I give money to the National Wildlife Foundation, right? I'm a good steward of the environment. But burning fossil fuels increases global warming. Well, you know, I heard from the president that those scientists don't always know what they're talking about. He just said it last week. I heard him just like that. He said, them scientists don't know what they're talking about. And I'm the president, so you should believe me. I come from Texas. I know about that stuff. So, guess what? I think the president's right. I believe my president. I'm a good citizen. Right? So yeah. Good.
Does this feel cross-culturally? Does it have to do with with that need for self-esteem? Like, does it tie into having a good being a good opinion of yourself and not feel?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it stronger in those collectivist cultures? This stuff? Or is there any definition?
So the question is cognitive dissonance stronger in collectivist cultures? I just did some research on this morning, and I haven't read the article yet, but from the abstract that I read, it's not that it's different, it's fundamentally the same, but the way people change their beliefs is different in collectivist cultures. And what I mean by that is they typically will change their beliefs to feel as if they are doing the right thing in terms of their social group or their society. But I'll know more about it when I get to read that article in detail. Yeah, I'll probably do that this weekend. So. Okay, but that's a good question. It's something I thought of while I was reading today, and I actually looked it up. Okay, so we resolve this inconsistency by bringing our beliefs back into consistency. And so we can bring our beliefs back into consistency in one way by changing what we think, or in another way by distorting the things that we think, distorting the evidence, not paying attention to evidence, right? We can use those biases to do that. We can use heuristics. And so in this example with smoking, we can reduce the cognitions we have about health risks. So maybe I just don't think about the health risks of smoking anymore. I enjoy it.
It'll never happen to me.
I enjoy it. You know what? My Uncle Jim smokes 3 packs a day. He's done that his whole life, and he's 80 years old. Right? We'll find instances that'll help confirm our beliefs. And so this allows us, for one thing, to pay less attention to those risk-relevant cognitions, or we can interpret them as more or less accurate. So yeah, my Uncle Jim, he smoked 3 packs a day he's been alive for 80 years. Those studies really probably aren't very accurate. Or I can just say, well, you know what? I just don't choose to hear about it anymore. I'm just not going to pay attention. So we find all kinds of ways to help ourselves feel better and feel that our attitudes are more consistent with our behaviors. Questions on cognitive dissonance?
That just kind of explains a little bit about, I've noticed among African American culture, it's fried foods aren't bad, because, so-and-so aunt, whoever, it's been eating for how many years, she's been frying food every single day of her life, and she's fine, she lives to be 90, whatever. And that is huge, you can ask any person coming from Black Girl, they'll tell you, fried food's not bad, are you kidding me? It's like, grandma, she's been eating fried food for her whole life, she grew up on fried food. But yeah, it's definitely a big one. That's just what I know.
And so that not only helps them feel good as an individual, it helps those people feel good about these shared customs, these shared traditions, these shared foods that we've had for generations. And that provides, there's some good things to this, right? It's not that it's always bad. It does give us some benefits, but it also sets us up for the possibility of creating a situation where we're going to create, what's going on? What did I do? Is something happening over here? All right, another one of those. Yeah, did you have a question, Brianna?
I was just gonna kind of ask, you do decide to change your behavior, then do other cognitions come into place that you have to kind of go through this whole process again?
No. Really, you can change your behavior or you can change your cognitions, your attitudes. sometimes behaviors are easier to change and sometimes attitudes are easier to change. And if you change your behavior so that it is consistent with your attitudes, then there's no more inconsistency. You don't have to do anything. Yeah.
Has it been studied like the effect of your social environment and like whether you're around a bunch of people who kind of deny health risks? If it's easier, you just assume it'd be easier not to change your behavior instead of change. I have a friend who is surrounded by smokers and people that do like don't stop drinking. She stopped drinking, smoking, and all this stuff in like under a week and hasn't done it. Like it's ridiculous to think. It's hard to see how she made the change so quickly. Just, I guess,
Individual differences, yeah. There are conformity pressures in groups that are gonna make it more difficult to do, but yeah. Yep, Frank.
I said it sounds like what is it, the arousal thing that, it seems logic based, and I'm wondering because I don't know why maybe I'm grasping at straws, but I guess when in history you see like really strange cultures that don't really make logical sense, and maybe it seems like it's more back in history than now, and I'm wondering if they didn't, is it basically this is a function of logic through time of people being able to think of this, oh, it really doesn't make sense, then I gotta change something, and before they wouldn't know because logic wouldn't be such a part of their lives.
No, I don't think it's so much that. Are you just talking about superstitious beliefs, or?
Well, I guess I was just thinking of things that something that I don't know, maybe some footnote in history that just sounds funny when you read it. Like, why would they do that? Because they believe, it just sounds weird. And so it just doesn't make.
people with leeches, are you thinking like something like that?
Sure. Simple thing. I've been trying to think of it while everybody's talking. I'm like, I can't think of a single example, but it makes me think of this, and I'm thinking, well, maybe because logic wasn't so, I don't know, daily relevant or so important. I mean,
Well,
3,000 years ago compared to now.
yeah. Well, there has been some benefit for, in public education, one of the things that you're taught, well, hopefully, one of the things you learn is critical thinking, and in this class, certainly you're learning about the scientific method and how we test things and how we don't just willy-nilly decide that, leeches are going to cure cancer. We have to have some basis for coming to that conclusion, right? So the advancement of science and the advancement of critical thinking in education is certainly going to have some effects, but I don't know of any kinds of studies that have tried to look at that, but yeah.
Because it seems like it has a basic on logic. I wouldn't know any. That's the only subconscious thought process in humans that I can see that has some kind of basis on logic besides just the need to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Most everything else is pretty stupid, crazy, or something.
Yeah, well, just because we do crazy things doesn't mean we're crazy.
Was it like when my uncle was one of the first Mount Roman, and of course he died of emphysema, just like.
Oh, I didn't know that. Huh, wow.
And but back then, so my pictures of my grandma, like with syrup, were like on like big long. It was social norm to do it then. Well, now it's social norm not to smoke. Like I work in a place that still lets people smoke inside because it's still legal until 2009. And people come in and they're like, "Oh, you can smoke in here?" Like, because social norms changed, then all of a sudden we have these struggles that we didn't have before.
Yep.
That's sort of what you're
Yep. Social norms are going to have big effects on it.
based on.
And then, of course, in the 50s and 60s, the doctors were actually telling people to smoke, but
Yeah,
that's
what
another
I-
story altogether. Why don't we take a break? It's getting on 4 o'clock. I'm starting to run out of juice here. About 10 minutes.
Funniest.
Okay, so we're going to talk about conformity. And the research on conformity really takes off after World War II. And the social problem or the social question that really spurred some of the research on conformity and ultimately on obedience was how could the regular everyday soldiers that were drafted by the Nazis, these are people off the street, just regular everyday people, how could they engage and be complicit in the atrocities that occurred during the Holocaust, when somewhere between 11 and 13 million people were systematically mass murdered? And so, of course, a lot of it came down to these people defended their actions by saying, well, I was ordered to do it. And so one of the proposals after the Nuremberg trials, when these people went on trial for war crimes, was look at all these Germans who did this awful stuff, and all they could say was, I was ordered to do it. And as we all know, Americans wouldn't do such a thing. They would defy these terrible orders. So it must be the German personality. There must be something about the, intrinsic to Germans that would cause them to be able to do these awful things. And of course, social psychologists are not particularly happy about this idea, because we believe in the power of the situation over people's behavior more so than individual dispositions. And so a social psychologist named Solomon Asch decided to run a series of experiments to test what kinds of things would get people to go along with a group of other people. How could I get you to go along with something when you really knew that what you were going along with was not correct? So he set up his experimental paradigm. Whoops, I'm not going to show you that. He set up his experimental paradigm, and he set it up as a line length perception experiment. So he advertised for subjects, and they were going to come into a lab and do some line length perception stuff. And what he did was he had 7 subjects. One of those people was the actual subject. The other 6 were, in social psychology, we use the term Confederates of the experimenter. They were going along with the experimenter. They were in on the whole thing with the experimenter. And the idea was that all of these Confederates, except for the subject, would agree on the line length. And sometimes they would agree that the correct line was the line that was supposed to be answered, and sometimes they would use the wrong answers. Now, the easiest thing to do for me is to show you kind of how this works. And so I dug up a little video clip, and it was done probably, judging by the clothes, I think it was done in like the mid-70s, really bad clothes, mid-70s. And it's a little cheesy in parts, but I think it gives you the idea of how this experiment was run. So I'll let you watch that.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are Confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence. Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1.
1.
1.
2. 1. 2.
2.
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1.
1.
2.
1.
2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials, compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go...
So what he finds is that about a third of the time they would go along. Now, the way that the experiments actually ran, this is a little oversimplified. What happened was typically people would fight the group for the first few times, and then they would eventually start just going along with the group. So people do put up a resistance to these conformity pressures, but eventually if the pressure is strong enough and if the right conditions are present, they'll still go along with it. Now, the thing is that if we say that only 33% were willing to go along with the group, that means that 67% of the time they decided not to. Now, as I said, that may be because at the beginning they kind of started fighting things and then eventually they just give in. But there's also the idea that we're all individuals. And so whenever we're studying a phenomenon in social psychology, we're also very careful to know that there are individual differences between people. For example, in the personality topic, we talked about locus of control. That's an example of an individual difference that will act as a moderator on how you respond to a particular situation. So what Ash then took this experiment. He started running a bunch of variations on the experiment to find out what the situational influences were that would increase conformity. And he found that one thing that'll increase conformity a lot is when the other participants are part of the subject's in-group. And an in-group is basically people that are like you. So let's say that if we brought a bunch of people in and we had the subject and the 6 Confederates and they were all from the same fraternity, right?